Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
President, I want to thank my colleague who just spoke about some really important issues. Senator Grassley from Iowa talked about the fentanyl crisis that's facing our country. Unfortunately, this synthetic opioid is now killing more and more Americans. We're back to record levels of overdose deaths, and probably 2/3 of them are caused by fentanyl. And he's absolutely right. We need to be sure it's scheduled clearly as an illegal drug, as well as all the variants of it. I'm coming on the floor today to talk about another issue that is really important to our country, and that is protecting us from cyber attacks. Last night, I commend this body because the United States Senate passed legislation called the Strengthening American Cybersecurity Act of 2022. What does that mean? It means that we took the time to do our homework, had hearings, and reported out legislation that helps protect our government data, including personal data of American citizens, but also our national security data and other sensitive information from cyber attacks. Also, we put in place provisions to help protect the private sector, particularly critical infrastructure. And what's going on right now around the world, particularly with regard to Russia and Ukraine, incredibly important that we put up better defenses here in this country, as well as helping Ukraine and other countries to fight against these cyber attacks. In recent years, we have seen this time and time again. I'm sure you remember the Colonial Pipeline. Remember they shut down gasoline distribution to the eastern part of the United States. These were cyber attacks. You've probably heard of some of these other cyber attacks like solar winds, or ones where these criminal gangs demand a ransom using so-called ransomware. This is happening increasingly. And again, my concern is, particularly with what's going on today in our volatile and dangerous world, that it will continue to happen and even become much more dangerous for us. The House of Representatives now has a chance to take up this legislation and pass it. They've been working with us on this all along on a bicameral basis, the House and the Senate, Republican, Democrat. This hasn't been a partisan issue. It's been one of these issues where we've worked together. Senator Peters, who's the chair of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, I'm the ranking Republican, top Republican. We worked together on this, but so did a lot of other members across the aisle. Senator Rubio and Senator Warner, Senator Collins, and others. They, by the way, represent the Intelligence Committee, which also has a strong interest in this. In my role as the ranking member on Homeland Security, we spent a lot of time focused on the oversight of this issue, how to respond to things like solar winds we talked about, or a Colonial Pipeline, or other cyber attacks. And what we have found is that these cyber attacks are increasingly sophisticated, and that our own government doesn't have the tools that they need, and that's why this legislation is so important. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an atrocity. It must not stand. But one of the things they have done in Ukraine for the last 8 years, and really before that as well, but particularly the last 8 years since 2014, when Ukraine decided to turn to the West, to turn to us, is Russia has done these cyber attacks relentlessly in Ukraine. And they are stepping them up right now, along with the horrible scenes we see of the bombings of innocent civilians in their apartment buildings. I saw today that not only have hospitals and child care institutions been bombed, but also the Holocaust Memorial in Kyiv has been damaged. So what the Russians are doing is appalling. And the entire freedom-loving world needs to stand up to it, and we need to help Ukraine more. But one thing they have also done is they've launched these cyber attacks against the Ukrainian government and against the private sector infrastructure in Ukraine. That, too, is a place where we can help. But again, we need to be sure that we have our own house in order here to be able to be more helpful, to be able to provide the best practices, and to help Ukraine be able to deal with these attacks, both kinetic attacks, these military attacks, and also the cyber attacks. Many times the cyber attacks are also mixed with disinformation attacks, because they are also, the Russians are flooding the zone and trying to take their disinformation and their lies and spread it around to the Ukrainian people. By the way, not many people are believing it anymore because it's so outrageous. In China, we see another sophisticated cyber adversary ramping up their rhetoric and their incursion into Taiwan's air defense zone. All these threats make enacting this legislation we passed last night all the more important. Legislation has three complementary bills combined into one. First, it'll protect our critical infrastructure better from cyber attacks by increasing our visibility as a country into these cyber attacks and building the government's ability to warn potential victims and mount a nationwide defense and provide best practices to our critical infrastructure. It'll strengthen the government's own response and recovery capabilities, protecting sensitive data as well. And finally, it will make government acquisition and use of cloud services more secure, more accountable, more efficient, and significantly keep countries like China and Russia from being able to access the cloud. All of these bills were passed out of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee with strong bipartisan support, and again, it passed the Senate overwhelmingly last night. The first of these bills that I mentioned is called the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure, whether by foreign governments like Russia and China or criminal organizations, are, of course, a serious national security threat. Today, no one U.S. government agency has visibility into all the cyber attacks occurring against critical infrastructure on a daily basis. We need that. We need to know what's going on to be able to warn other infrastructure and to be able to respond quickly. Right now, if Russia initiates a cyber campaign against U.S. critical infrastructure, there would be nothing to ensure that the U.S. government is notified of that so it can mount a nationwide response and, again, warn other critical infrastructure operators similarly situated. This bill would change that, enabling a coordinated, informed U.S. response to cyber attacks against the United States. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act will require critical infrastructure owners and operators to report substantial cyber attacks within 72 hours and ransomware payments within 24 hours to what's called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's called CISA. CISA has done an effective job in the Trump administration now, in the Biden administration, but they need these tools to be able to do a better job. CISA, having this information, would be able to use the data to immediately contact the FBI and other appropriate law enforcement, but also to help with best practices to mitigate the damage and to warn other critical infrastructures of threats, help these victims recover, analyze trends, and enable a whole-of-the-nation defense and response to these attacks. It's cyber attack. It's not soldiers with guns, but it can have some of the same horrible impacts and damage to our economy and to individuals. Again, think of the oil pipeline, Colonial Pipeline, being basically shut off to the whole east coast of the United States. The second bill that's part of this package is called the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or FISMA. FISMA is the acronym for the way in which we protect our federal agencies. And unfortunately, we know that federal agencies, government agencies, have failed to protect Americans' data, our data, personal data. Last August, I released a report with Chairman Peters detailing the significant cybersecurity vulnerabilities of 8 different key federal agencies: Homeland Security, State, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Agriculture, Education, and the Social Security Administration. The Social Security Administration, where a lot of our sensitive information is kept. This report that we issued followed a report just a few years ago, in 2019, that I issued with Senator Carper when I was chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And we investigated all 8 of these agencies to determine how they were doing in terms of pushing back against cyber attacks. In last year's report, only the Department of Homeland Security had an effective cyber security program. No other agency we reviewed met the standard. And we found that government-wide, the average cybersecurity grade in pushing back against these cyber attacks was a C-. Not the grade I would have wanted to take home to my parents. But that's the truth. We're just not prepared. The report identifies several common agency vulnerabilities, including the failure to protect personally identifiable information. Again, think about some of these agencies, HHS or Social Security. That's a big issue. Second, maintain an accurate list of the agency's IT equipment so they know what they have. Third, install security patches quickly. And fourth, replace vulnerable and insecure legacy technology. A lot of these agencies have technology that needs to be updated, that's stovepiped, in other words, isn't working well together, and that makes it difficult for them to push back against these cyber attacks. In the 7 years since FSMA was last updated, federal agencies have had these same vulnerabilities year after year, putting America's data at risk. So this legislation takes the important steps to remedy these systemic problems we identified. It incorporates recommendations from my bipartisan reports with Senator Peters and Senator Carper, and will adopt a risk-based approach to cybersecurity budgeting, position the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, we talked about earlier, as the lead agency in securing these federal networks. There needs to be accountability, and that's missing now. We need to require agencies to notify Americans whose personal identifiable information is compromised during a breach. To me, this is just a basic requirement for government. If you have personal information that's been breached because a government system has not been properly protected, you ought to be told about that so you can take your own steps to protect yourself. Complement the Cyber Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act by ensuring that federal agencies and contractors also notify CISA when they suffer a breach. We talked about that earlier, but having that information is very helpful. And finally, update the requirements for congressional notification when an agency suffers a major cyber incident. We have an oversight responsibility here. We need to know if there's been a major cyber attack. Finally, this legislation includes a third part, which is called the FedRAMP Authorization Act. This is the one that will authorize the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program that deals with cloud computing and protecting the cloud. FedRAMP is a government-wide program administered by the General Services Administration that provides agencies and cloud service providers with a standard approach to evaluating, authorizing, and monitoring the security of cloud services. So when a federal government agency wants to use the cloud services, they've got to go through this process. In the first 4 years of FedRAMP, the program authorized only 20 cloud service providers. Today, there are more than 230 cloud service providers, 30% of which are small businesses. This act builds on the successes of FedRAMP and agencies' continued push to adopt commercial cloud solutions by addressing existing costs and processing times. But it also includes measures to strengthen the government's response to foreign interference in our cloud systems. Supply chain security experts have warned us about the weaknesses in FedRAMP that leave our cloud systems vulnerable to interference from countries like Russia and China, North Korea, Iran. The reforms in this bill will allow for increased transparency and better monitoring of possible foreign influences in FedRAMP-approved systems. For example, it requires an agency to review, on an interagency basis, government standards to identify and assess the origin of software and code to provide the transparency and accountability needed into the FedRAMP-approved systems that are developed and maintained by foreign engineers in countries like Russia and China. This bill also requires private sector third-party assessment organizations to disclose to GSA any information they have related to any foreign interests, any foreign influences, any foreign control, of course, or ownership, and to report a change in foreign ownership or control to GSA within 48 hours. We've had instances like this where we're using cloud-based services that then become bought by a foreign entity, and that is not reported, and therefore they continue to provide these services, which is something we need to stop. I commend the hard work of so many of my colleagues in crafting this broader legislation, including Chairman Peters, Chairman Warner, Ranking Member Rubio, Senator Collins of the Intelligence Committee, as well as so many other colleagues on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee and the Intel Committee. I also want to thank our colleagues in the House, particularly Representatives Clark and Katko, because this has been a truly bicameral exercise, both in terms of the oversight, identifying what the problems are, and coming up with appropriate legislation. And by the way, this legislation is strongly supported by those in the administration who are responsible for dealing with cyber attacks. They need these tools, and they want these tools. We are not done yet, because it's just passed the Senate, it has not passed the House, but we need to move quickly to enact these important changes to modernize our cyber security posture. I urge the House to act quickly, to be sure we can protect ourselves from cyber attacks, particularly in this increasingly dangerous environment. I would hope that we could send this critically important legislation to the President's desk for signature very soon, and be sure we are doing all we know to do to be able to better protect our country and our citizens from cyber attacks. Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent to have my remaining comments be in a separate part of the journal.
Without objection.
President, we're also on the floor today talking about the postal reform legislation. I know we're going back and forth trying to determine how many amendments will be offered and which amendments are germane or relevant to the legislation or not. But let me just say we already had a strong vote to move to this legislation. We had a vote of over 70 members, which is rare around here, a strong bipartisan vote saying, let's move forward with this postal reform. And it's really important we do it because the post office is in deep trouble. And if we don't act, it's going to get a lot worse. We're going to have big problems. In looking at this issue, again, in my oversight responsibilities on the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee, it looks like in the next few years, the post office would probably go insolvent. And none of us wants that. And by the way, when that happens, there will probably be a big government bailout. So this legislation, along with internal reforms that the post office is making themselves, and I commend them for that, is intended to avoid that problem. It's intended to ensure that we can get this under control before there is an insolvency. Right now, the post office is projecting a 10-year loss of $160 billion if we just continue with the status quo. The reality is the post office is in a tough business situation. Think about it. How many first-class letters have you sent recently? And how many did you send 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Probably more. Increasingly, we are relying on sending things by email and not sending by first-class mail. That changes the post office's business model. They're also delivering to more and more addresses because everybody wants to be connected to the post office, to receive packages, to receive other kinds of mail, advertising, newspapers, bills. People who are reliant on getting their prescriptions through the mail are very eager to see the post office be strong and of course, be a post office that addresses their universal service requirement. In other words, goes to every single mailbox around America. So the math doesn't work very well when you've got more and more addresses and not as much first-class mail to be sent out. That's one reason that the post office is in trouble, and we need to address that new reality. The current Postmaster General, by the way, his name is Louis DeJoy, came and talked to some of us yesterday about this and talked about an ambitious plan that he's embarked on, along with the support of the Postal Board of Governors and the support of the previous administration and this administration, to ensure that we can transform the post office by finding efficiencies, including transforming existing capabilities to make sure they more efficiently meet the needs of the American people. He has a 10-year plan that makes changes to make the post office more efficient, but it also continues to have this universal service obligation where everybody's going to be getting their mail. In fact, under our legislation, there's also a 6-day-per-week mail delivery requirement. So not just that everybody's post office box or mailbox or door is being serviced by the post office, but that it's done 6 days a week. But he needs help to do that. In particular, he's made it very clear to us that he needs the financial space to be able to put these reforms in place, to be able to take away some of the huge liabilities that they currently face at the post office. That's what we do in this legislation. First, we eliminate a burdensome pre-funding requirement for retiree health benefits. Now, this has really been a problem for the post office. It's made their lives much more difficult. We mandated this in Congress back in 2006 for current employees. This has crippled the post office financially. You should know, by the way, pre-funding of health care retiree benefits is something the federal government does not do. So other agencies and departments don't have to do that. It's also not something the private sector does. So it's something that the post office uniquely has had to deal with, and it, again, has been a financial burden for them that has really made their financial statements extremely difficult. Second, we require post office employees who are retiring, who have been paying into Medicare their entire career, by the way, to join up with Part B and Part D of Medicare. In other words, to go into Medicare, and instead of having the federal employee health benefit plan be their plan, to have that be the backup and have Medicare be their primary payer. Everybody's in Part A, by the way, already, Medicare Part A, But some Postal Service employees are not enrolled in Part B and Part D. Now, about 75% are enrolled in entire Medicare, but again, about 25% are not. So that saves money for the post office because Medicare is not as generous a program, frankly, as Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan or the new Postal Service Federal Health Benefit Plan. Third, we require the Postal Service to maintain its current standard of this 6-day-a-week delivery, which we talked about, through an integrated delivery system of mail and packages. That simply says that the status quo ought to continue so that you are delivering packages and letters at the same time, not separately. That would be incredibly inefficient to say, okay, you're going to have a separate system for packages and a separate system for letters. In addition to doing all these things, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the bill is going to save money. It's going to save $1.5 billion a year to the American taxpayer. I'd also like to note what the bill does not do, because there's been some misinformation out there, including one editorial I saw recently. One, it doesn't appropriate any new funds to the United States Post Office. Two, it does not change the accounting or cost structure for packages and letters. So it does not disadvantage private sector carriers. It's the status quo, and that's very important to me. Third, it does not impact the solvency of the Medicare Hospital Trust Fund. That's the Part A trust fund that's going broke in a short number of years. And that's the big focus of a lot of us to ensure that doesn't happen. This doesn't affect Part A trust fund at all. It also does not increase the Medicare Part B or Part D premiums. And that's important, I think, to a lot of us. And finally, it does not allow the post office to enter into new commercial services like postal banking, which I believe would be a big mistake. The legislation received strong bipartisan support when it was taken up in the House of Representatives a couple weeks ago. It passed by a vote of 342 to 92. Not much gets passed in terms of major legislation along those lines, and I'm proud of the people who worked hard on this on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol to come up with a bipartisan bill. It's not the bill any one of us would have written, but it's the right bill to save the post office. I think Republicans and Democrats alike in the House looked at this and said, we got to do something here. We do not want the post office to go belly up. Some say that this is a whole lot better than the alternative. I agree with that. I think that's one of the reasons we need to pass this. It does get the Postal Service back on track. Again, with the reforms being undertaken internally at the post office itself, that combination of what we're doing here to provide them some financial space to be able to make the reforms and the reforms that they're doing. So I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting the legislation. Let's put the Postal Service in a position to succeed, to continue to provide these essential services that small businesses, that our veterans, with regard to their health care, prescriptions being delivered, with our rural constituents, absolutely needing the post office to be there to service them. They rely on this. And that's why so many, again, of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle strongly support this legislation. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Peters, for working with us over time to find the consensus on this bill. Let's pass it and ensure that the Postal Service, the post office, remains viable for years and years ahead. Nothing is more important to my rural constituents, who talk to me about this quite a bit, than ensuring that the post office stays healthy. It's really important to, again, some of the veterans I represent who get their needed medication through the mail. It's important to our voting system in this country because a lot of voting is by mail, including in Ohio, where for many years we've had absentee voting that is no-fault absentee. But we rely on the post office to ensure that our ballots get delivered on time. So this is an opportunity for us on a bipartisan basis to ensure the post office remains strong. And I hope we take advantage of it and pass this legislation and have appropriate amendments in the meantime and get this done in short order. I yield back my time.